mixed use, of course, has been proposed or promoted for a long time. Let me introduce something else here. The city had a pretty active group of planning-oriented citizens. The Community Arts Council, very significant institution. The Community Planning Association, a very significant institution. The Housing Association of Vancouver, a significant institution. So these are all big players, but they all had certain things to contribute. The Community Planning Association of Vancouver was the main promoter of mixed use. Year upon year they would have meetings, and they would bring in speakers, and they would bring in debate about the opportunity of piling commercial and residential and to some degree recreational uses in the same building. Tom MacDonald, he was part of this team group, for instance. Tom deserves a great deal of credit for that particular issue. He's long gone, but you know, here's another man who really has made that happened to have been his own special interest. He lived in the West End, and he promoted this idea of multiple use, as we call it, rather than mixed use, and making the commercial, residential, recreational package work. Peter Stratton, another name, long forgotten. Now, without Peter, the Housing Association would never have worked. And he lived in the West End. And he, again, you know, in other words, apart from the stars that you've interviewed, there have been a lot of other people who, in their own way, managed to, advance ideas. Tom MacDonald and the multiple use. Peter Stratton, Board of Trade. He was in the Board of Trade. Every meeting I can still see him there. We need more what we now call social housing. In those days it was simply public housing. And without him, all these projects in Chinatown would never have happened.
Was he responsible in part for the notion of mixed residential from high-end commercial through social housing, like they have in Falls Creek, for example?
Yeah, but that came much later. Sure, I mean, Walter Hardwick could not have achieved what without Peter Stratton. It's very simple. A, they knew each other, and B, that was the kind of process. So that, you know, when your father championed certain things, and Philip and all the others in City Council, except Pendecourt, they were building on these elements. And, you know, it was people like Stratton and Tom MacDonald who were pitting for City Council and said, yes, let's do this. You know, as you will discover when you get to City Council, that you need a public support. And you're going to build that support. And there were these other people out there, like Elsa Larson, like Tom MacDonald, like Peter Stratton, Peter Hebb, all kinds of people. Actually his mother. Or, here's a wonderful character, you must somehow get it there. Well, never mind. Okay, next question.
I'm still interested in the early decision to steer away from the freeways, because it anticipated, I believe, that the proliferation of automobiles just wasn't going to stop. And the fact that we could never build enough freeways, as long as there were, you know, more and more and more cars being built and the population increasing. It's interesting. To me, it's self-evident. But at the time, there was a different way of looking at things, especially vis-a-vis the automobile. Everybody had a two-car garage. There was much more of an emphasis on cars than there is now. But that's come out of necessity, as we've dealt with densification in areas like the West End, for example. But it was, in my view, it was way ahead of its time that it should have been recognized in 1968 that there was going to be so much automobile pressure on the central business district and through the core of the city.
Well, I understand and hear what you're saying. I wonder whether your father would agree. Because I think the facts that I remember are slightly different. Out of the post-war period, ownership of car was an extraordinarily important achievement. This was not just four wheels. This was a very important status that you had achieved, and the motor car was the symbol of progress because they had fins and all kinds of other elements, and it was sold not because you can get around faster, it was sold on because of the opportunity that it demonstrates that you've arrived. So the motor car was something terribly important to this emerging group of people who could afford a car and then could afford two cars. Wow! That's very important. In other words, we're not just dealing here with a technical, but a very real social cultural elevation that made the car a very significant component of our life. Now, full stop, next paragraph. Every building in the downtown area, by bylaw, was encouraged to provide parking. You couldn't get a building permit unless you provided on the ground floor or below umpteen units, and they were scaled to the scale of the building. You know, if you had 2 for every square foot or 1 for every square foot, you know the basic background. So that was not a question of choice. So if you built a office building, as they did in the 50s and 60s, you had to provide these downtown parking lots. There was a conditio sine qua non. So the public policy encouraged it as well. So while you are right in saying what you've done, I think you will recognize the social cultural opportunities of the motor car and then the push by the public domain. Today we go the other way. You know, we say don't provide parking, pay for it or something, you know. But in those days it was all to do with, in the shopping center. Anyway.
I'm interested in the larger context. Let's go back to...
do you follow what I'm trying to explain?
I do,
yeah,
I do.
good.
I'm just trying to figure out how to recharacterize it for today and then contrast it to where we were in 1968, for example. From 1968 until 1972, when TEAM took over control of council, you've described it as an incremental process.
Oh, yes.
Can you describe some of the key issues during that period of time before you took control?
Well, in a sense, sure. I can give you one more sort of example as to the discussion I had with your father many times. 68, he went to city council, and Art was there, and Fritz Bowers, and I forgot the third man, he taught math at UBC, was the school board. What was important is that actually UBC had launched half a dozen academics in the political arena. Never done before. Hadn't happened before. So there were 3 academics on the school board, 1 academic in city council, and there may have been 2 in Parks board. No, Bill Gibson, of course. Bill Gibson was in the Parks board. No, well, Bill is at the very beginning of, that's another guy. You must see Bill. I don't know if you've talked to him. So, okay, so that's 67, 68, all right? So now the question is, what can we do? And what can we do to build what I call the caucus process? You know, to actually find some way of making, A, the numbers grow, and B, really build on a more rational, policy-oriented public process. What issues would really become significant? Well, things are external as well as internal. Vancouver was not the only place in Canada. This is the beginning of Trudeau. And that's not inconsequential. Because in 70, when I was scheduled to run for city council, I had an offer to go to Ottawa. And therefore I didn't run for city council. I became Deputy Minister of Urban Affairs. I had to set up a new ministry dealing with urban affairs across the country. And that was a wonderful opportunity, not only for the country in a sense, but for Vancouver to link and relate to what could become, and did become ultimately, Falls Creek. You know.
Who was the minister?
Well, I had 3. It was a very important part of the dynamics. Bob Andras, whom you had never heard of, a wonderful guy. But the second one was equally critical because he was the member for Vancouver Centre, Ronnie Basford. So you had the deputy and the minister from Vancouver. So that was a pretty reasonable combination of influence. So, when you talk about what projects, it was these projects that we all thought we might do and were doable. And now that I'd moved to Ottawa as deputy minister for the next almost 4 years, here was an opportunity of doing things that city council here just couldn't do alone.
Now, that would have coincided with the Granville Island.
Absolutely. Without it, absolutely. I've got the documents to prove it. So the point is, you've got to see it in the context of a much larger political change. And the Trudeau era was a very important part of the change, in my view.
Now, you said there were, just out of interest, you said there were 3 ministers, so after Ron Basford, there was a third?
Yeah, sure. In fact, there were 4 ultimately, but 3. Barney Danson. I don't know, ring a bell.
Yes.
Yes. He then went on to Minister of Defense. And Ouellette was the last. You see Ouellette? Does that ring a bell?
Right. But Ron Basford continued his involvement with Granville Island beyond that.
Oh, sure, because he was the local MP. But the key was that he was Minister of Urban Affairs.
Now, I know that Dad had started working on Falls Creek. His initial paper on land use economics was back in 1958.
Yeah.
But, and I assume that from 68 until they took control in 72, there, a lot of the groundwork was done so that when they swept in 72, they were able to affect the kind of wholesale changes with the land swaps and rezoning change.
But not only this, but they had an agenda. It wasn't just how to do it, but they had an agenda. I mean, that's the point that I try to make. Forgive me for being insistent, but it was a change in how and not just what to do. And the agenda was to have a policy platform. And the policy platform started with the paper, among others, that your father produced. Safety Pendico produced material, and a number of other people. Who was the man in land economics who produced? Anyway, the Academy produced a lot of stuff at the time. And then these 4 or 5 people stepped up and actually ran for office, which is different from just providing information.
So in 72, when they took over council, with the majority on council, you were still in Ottawa.
That's right.
And were you out in Vancouver at the time of the election?
I was there. Yes.
I remember, I was there that night, but I was 12, so.
Well, it's all right. Perfectly okay.
Was
You're lucky you were 12. I wish I would have been 12 then.
Oh, it was so exciting.
Yeah, it's quite right. No, it was exciting because it was the culmination of about 5 years of work. And that's really terribly important. This is not something that happened overnight. And it was a fundamental change in the politics of governing the city of Vancouver. And then ultimately GBRD, because, you know, these things are not unrelated. Harry Lash, you know, another guy in this whole business. So there's any number of actors, and they each have their own slot and in each contribution. I mean, I was out here as deputy many times for many, many reasons, and almost invariably I would have a chat with your father or with Art or somebody and say, you know, what are we going to do? And we would try and plot. And you know, CMHC played a very critical role. And I was the director of CMHC for 4 years. And CMHC was not exactly, what's the word, rational crown corporation. It was a maintenance company. So that had to be changed.
And then throughout that period, you had passing contact with Dad.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And then, weren't you in, then was Habitat after?
That came in 74. That was my last hurrah, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Okay, let's start with the significant change in 68 when Trudeau became Prime Minister, because that is not inconsequential. A, locally, and B, nationally. Now, out of this came the creation of a federal Ministry of Urban Affairs. Highly controversial, against the Constitution, but essential in order to manage what had become a crucial change in Canada. Canada was no longer 10 provinces, it now had become 3 cities. And certainly what happened since then has corroborated that change with a vengeance. Now, having said this, the Constitution still claims that we are 10 provinces, which is a very archaic and unfortunate kind of construct. So, out of the notion that Canada is becoming urbanized, Trudeau and those around him said, look, we're going to do something about the enormous federal impact on the city. I don't know whether you recall, but since then and today, as we sit here, the largest single landowner in any city in this country is the federal government. The largest single employer in any given city is the federal government. That includes Victoria. So the concept that federal had nothing to do with the city is nonsense. Okay, out of this came 2 things. The Minister of State for Urban Affairs, responsible for making some sense out of the federal system on behalf of the city. The physical result, Granville Island, Falls Creek,